So now I'm going to work in an example that is more similar to the artist examples that we're looking at. And this is more in the direction that I want you to go for. I don't really want to see pictures with sock monkeys in it. We just did that for practice, in part because Soft Monkey had some great curves and it was a good practice for working with the pen tool. So in this image, I'm just going to go through some of the steps to build an image similar to this. And this is the finished one, and so I'm going to turn off all of my layers here so we can go back to what was the original. So the original, I have to disable my layer mask here. This is the original image that it starts with, and it's combined with the same sky image, and then there is a cathedral in the background. So this is a starting point. For your hyperreality, you would need to have even more images added to this. So to block out the sky, it's that same procedure. Just simply make a selection and then click on the layer mask, and it's going to convert that into a layer. Like, sometimes when you have a selection and it's just really, really hard, you could also go in and simply clone out. If there are little bits of sky in between that are of the original that are still showing, you could go and just clone those to get rid of them. I'll just do a quick example, and I'm even going to just do this destructively. I'm not going to even bother to create a new layer. So if I just take like a small section here, and I just want to kind of go over and get rid of some of those little bits of sky that's showing up in the background. It's perfectly acceptable for small amounts like this. I'm just going to go and touching that up. Okay, so that's how I was able to replace the sky here. And now the next thing is that cathedral. So this is the end result of the cathedral in the background. Actually, not the full end result. That is. So let's go backwards here. So if I have that original image of the cathedral, I did look for something that was at least shot at the same angle. You can see that this bridge image here is shot from the right hand side and has a slight perspective to it. And so is this cathedral here. But the cathedral kind of dips down, or this one goes this way. So the next step would be to change the perspective. I can go up to, make sure I'm on the right layer, go up to Edit, Transform, and for this I would try Perspective and Skew, and you might end up using both of them, sort of doing them at the one right after another. And what I want is for the slant of that cathedral to kind of follow the same slant that I have of the bridge. So I might commit to that, and then actually what I found later on that really wasn't enough to be able to get it to look like it fit. I then, after I had it in the right spot, I went and back up to Edit, Transform, and I did the scale. So the next step is to mask off that whole background, and that's just going to be the same thing, making that selection tool, working with those selections, go into quick mask mode to touch up your selection, and then click on the mask icon. And now I'm going to switch over to my finished one. And there it is with the background masked off. You can see this little section there I think I missed. So we could touch that up. Nope, maybe that's part of something else. Okay, and so now how do we get the cathedral to look like it's behind the bridge? Well, for those of you who did that extra credit assignment that was maybe back in week 2 or week 3, simply what you do is make a selection of the part of the bridge that you want to cover up the cathedral and copy and paste that onto its own layer. So this would be a good one to use the polygonal. You could also use the anchor pen tools because it has a nice curve here. Make that selection and then Control J, and it's going to be on its own layer, and just make sure that layer is on top of the cathedral image. So now I have it placed back there. How do I get the reflection? Well, to do that, simply take your layer and duplicate it. You can click on it and drag it into the Create New Layer icon, and that is going to duplicate it. And then you want to flip it. So you can go up to Edit, Transform, Flip Vertically, and that's going to create this other version of your image, and you're going to put it right below. And I keep a little bit of space here because I think that the way a natural reflection happens, you don't see it continuing all completely. So it's sort of up to you where you want to place it, but a little bit of space. And then the next thing is, it needs to have like a little bit of a ripple here. So to add some kind of filter to it, I'm going to go up to Filter, and as I mentioned the last one, under Blur, there are all kinds of filters. You might want to try the Motion Blur for this one. I'm going to try the Tilt Shift Blur. I really like this one because it allows me to kind of click and drag where I'm going to have that blur start. So as I drag this down, I can change where the blur is happening. And I think this is really great for reflections because as an object goes further under the water, it is more blurry. So I can shift that down so the top part is a little bit more in focus and the bottom part, it goes completely out of focus. And then I click OK up in my options bar. And of course, there are a lot of options here that you can go through. I'm just going to let you work on those on your own. And now I have my reflection, just takes a second, added through. And I'm just going to go back to my original here. Is my original. There we go. That was my original one. And there's a little bit of mask left here that I see. No problem. I can go and touch that up with a little bit of the blue sky. Now moving on, what else could I do? I have my sky showing through, and I have my cathedral put back here, and I've changed the perspective a little bit of my cathedral, and I made a reflection and I put a blur on it. I have a third layer here that's covering up, so I makes it look like my cathedral's back here. There's little parts up here that definitely would need to get touched up. As I always say, I'm just going through these kind of quickly. So now is the point when I would start adding some lighting effects. So I turn this one on. So this is curves being used to make a very dramatic effect. But notice I use the curves with a layer mask. So I'm going to open this up. And what I did, let's see if I can just reset this back to the way it was. So when I'm working with the curves, I just have this straight line going through. Down here represents my shadows. These are my highlights. And right here is my midtones. Now keep in mind, I have already put a mask here. So what that mask does is I'm basically protecting this part of my image so it's not going to be affected by my curve. And I'm going to click into the middle section, my middle tones, and I'm going to drag it down. And that's what creates kind of a very high contrast image and can make for a really dramatic effect. So remember, you could just continue to work with that mask. You could use a textured brush going through. And in the next one, I'm going to actually talk about doing this with a gradient. So I'm going to close this one out. And so I wanted the same effect where I wanted kind of everything to turn black and white, except for what I have inside of here. So I created a layer adjustment going over here, the black and white one, which is going to make everything underneath appear black and white. So in fact, I'll do this over again. I'll turn this one off. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a gradient into my mask. And one thing we haven't talked about yet is how to add multiple gradients into a single mask. I'm going to take my gradient tool and I'm going to switch to the radial gradient because I want it to be more circular here. And all I need to do to be able to add multiple gradients is to make sure up here that I have chosen the black foreground to transparency. It won't work if I have it on white. And now I could have multiple gradients added to this image. So now this is how I can get a couple of different sections here. Maybe I just want to have a couple of sections showing through with some color. So remember, the idea with the hyperreality is it should look real, but yet we understand that it can't be real because it's surreal. It's too real. So for example, having everything in black and white, but just allowing this section to come through in color can make for a very dramatic effect and also give us that surreal environment. So again, that's just remembering that you can add the gradient to the layer mask. Just the trick is to make sure that up here, once you've chosen the gradient tool, that you have it selected to go to transparency. And when you're working with any one of those adjustment layers, make sure that you're also working with them with the mask as well, so you can really control where the effect is. Making masks on your images can be quite simple in terms of just making a selection and then clicking on the layer mask icon and it'll convert that. Sometimes you have to, depending on what you selected, invert it, but you just do that by hitting the invert button. And in this image as well, I also created that new layer, and I can go through those steps again like I did in the last one. Layer, new layer, and use the layer for being able to go in and manually make areas darker by switching it to overlay, fill it with neutral gray, and now paint over it. Just make sure that the opacity of your brush is really low, or else it's going to be too strong. And now I can go in and like really kind of control what areas of my image I want to have dark or not. And so this is all completely non-destructive, put onto its own layer. And lastly, just the simple tricks for making reflections. Duplicate the original layer and go through Edit, Transform, and flip it vertically, and then add some kind of blur to that layer. And the one that I used under blur was the tilt shift one, because it allowed you to really control where that blur happened. Okay, so this is a pretty good example as a starting point for, or not really a starting point, but as a midpoint for working on that hyperreality. And just keep in mind that I want you to add multiple different sections to the image. Everything should look seamless. So if I was looking at this one, I would say there's a little bit here that has to get cleaned up. And there's a little bit here that has to get cleaned up as well. So make sure all of your selections are really refined and that you're using all these techniques and that you really add multiple parts to the image.